Hello, bonjour, hello, hi, heya, and privyet, hockey fans. Welcome back to the EuroPuck podcast, the show where two Brits talk all things European hockey as part of the Hockey Podcast Network. My name is Hayden, or Odd Man Rush, as you can see up there, and joining me for the first time in a couple of weeks, is the first time we've actually got together for quite a while, it's my co-host, Chris Gadsby. Hey, Chris.
Hello!
Oh,
Hello, yes, we've been together. Well, I had a week off, then you had a week off, so it's been 3 weeks since we've last been together.
Yeah, and I can very much imagine that nothing has happened in our lives since.
No, nothing.
I mean, the only thing we can
really... I bought house insurance.
Oh, you bought house insurance? Wow. I mean...
I renewed the house insurance, yeah, that's...
exciting. Thrilling.
Oh, I know.
I mean, I bought myself a Wayne Gretzky jersey for my birthday. Does that
saw,
count?
Yeah.
I mean, that's exciting, right? It's hockey related, so it's something.
Hockey related.
Yeah, exactly. But today is what's the date today? It's Tuesday, the 3rd of November. It's our first episode in November. It's obviously the US election today. For other stuff that's been going on in England, the lockdown. We've got another month-long lockdown at least announced, so
yes!
Even though we've both been sat at home for pretty much all year long, we're being sat at home for a little bit longer, so, you know.
Yep. Well, I was anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
We got told a long time ago that we're staying at home until March at the earliest, so it doesn't really affect me.
No, and I just stay at home anyway because, you know, that YouTube grind. So, but anyway, even though there's been this lockdown announced, even though we've kind of, everything's a bit doom and gloom at the moment once again because it kind of feels like we're repeating what happened right at the beginning of the year. Luckily for you guys, we have a very special guest joining us again on this episode of the EuroPuck podcast. We've been... Chris and I have been very active looking for certain guests to come and bring on the show from sort of all over the hockey spectrum, whether it be commentators, coaches, writers, reporters, actual players themselves. We wanted to make sure we get a nice sort of variety to kind of mix things up instead of just going through scores and stats and news every single week. Obviously, we're going to come back to that as we go along. Especially when we were kind of in that late December, early January slow pace of, you know, everybody's kind of recovering from Christmas and they don't really want to make a guest appearance because they want to maybe lose a few of those Christmas pounds before they decide to go back on camera. But we have got Caitlin Berry joining us today on the EuroPuck podcast. And for those of you who either don't know who she is or kind of sounds familiar, especially to some UK hockey fans, she's very much involved with the OHL. She does a lot of reporting for Dobber Prospects, I believe, with regards to the Ontario Hockey League. She runs her own podcast, which I believe is called Hockey from Across the Pond. During the interview, we will double check to make sure that that is all right. We're literally about to interview her as we record this right now. So we've got some great questions lined up. She's very kindly taken some time out of her schedule. I believe she started a new job recently. So she was like, look, okay, I've got some time. I'll come and sit down for like 30 minutes, an hour and kind of just chat all about hockey because she's a writer, she's a blogger, she's a podcaster, and she's kind of similar to me and kind of similar to Chris to the extent of she's from the UK and she's a hockey fan and is kind of starting to make or has made a career out of it, which is a very unconventional thing to do here. So, Chris, I'm very excited to kind of get her thoughts on the OHL. She interviewed Liam Kirk a few weeks ago or a month or two ago. Interested to get her thoughts. What are you hoping to kind of get out of this interview?
Yeah, some really interesting stuff. She'll have some interesting stories as well. It'd be great to get another perspective of how somebody else has got into kind of this line of work that we find ourselves in. As you said, it's a more unusual line of work, and not. I don't think I met many people when you go through school that go, I want to be a hockey broadcaster. They wanted to be footballers, and not many people wanted to be. And even if you said hockey broadcaster, most people over here wouldn't understand you because they'd think you meant field hockey.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to get just another perspective and story about how they came to this wonderful sport of ice hockey.
Exactly, and I think that's the perfect place to insert the interview that we're about to have with Caitlin. So, without further ado, let me play for you the interview that Chris and I did with Caitlin Berry on the EuroPuck podcast. So, as some of you might be able to tell, Chris and I are joined here with a very special guest. We have Caitlin Berry here. who, as some of you might know, as we've talked about in the intro we've recorded, she's very much involved with the OHL. She does a lot of GIFs and a lot of tweeting about the OHL. She's got her own podcast, which I believe is called Hockey from Across the Pond. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I wanted to make sure I got the name right because I want to give you the plug that you deserve. You know, you're taking the time to come on the show. I may as well get the bloody name right, you know. So, yeah, we've got Caitlin Berry here, which I would reckon you could probably do a far better job than I could, Caitlin. Do you want to just, like, take a second to explain what you kind of do in the hockey world, where your kind of interests are, and just kind of give a brief overview to our listeners of, you know, what you do?
Okay, well, I kind of occupy a lot of kind of different spaces in the hockey world. I started off doing some hockey writing. I was a member of an OHL writing website for a while. That ended, and then I turned to mostly just the Twitter side of things. So I started a thing where I was trying to make GIFs and highlights and videos and clips of every single hockey game I could for about a year. And that seems to be the thing I'm still kind of doing right now, apart from the fact that we have no hockey. So while there's been no hockey on, so since the lockdown started and a bit before that, I've been doing a podcast with my friend Mark. And for some reason, we still have things to talk about, even though there's no hockey on. So it seems to be going kind of well.
Yeah, but believe me, I mean, we, Chris and I, on the Hockey Podcast Network, which this show is obviously on, we did the Boston Bruins last season, kind of up until the end of their playoff run. And, you know, when obviously hockey kind of came to a standstill, the world kind of came to a standstill last March. We had to sit there for, I think it was about half of our time we were doing the show. We didn't have any games to talk about. Is that right, Chris?
We did. We did best Bruins ever. We did fantasy drafts. We did all sorts. What was the last game you saw live then, Caitlin? Because we've been going back quite some way.
Oh yeah, live. Do you mean like in person or through video?
No, in person. The last one you're actually able to go to.
The last one I was actually able to go to was probably in Nottingham with the GBL qualifiers when they did that tournament earlier. I think in February this year, and that was the last games I was able to go to, and now everything is shut down for the foreseeable future.
Yep.
So sad.
Yep. And we just mentioned in our intro that obviously the UK is shutting down again. For another month, in the hope to save Christmas. Hopefully it's done by then, but you never know. 2020's been
I saw the first Christmas advert of the year yesterday, so...
I mean, 2020's been a fascinating year. I can never quite believe anything that happens. So, Caitlin, the biggest question I want to ask you, I think, out of all of the questions I think we might have is, how did you get involved in the OHL specifically? Because obviously becoming or getting involved in the sport of hockey from the UK is one thing, you know, getting involved in the EIHL or the NHL, because obviously it's the huge league that, you know, the biggest league in the world. But the OHL is kind of, it's very niche or you have to be really interested in the sport to even know that the OHL exists, especially across the pond over here. So how did you kind of get involved in that?
Yeah, it kind of came through like a series of different steps. Like first, as many UK hockey fans do, I got into the EIHL, which led to me watching the NHL. And then I think it was around 2016 when I was just getting into hockey, I got really into the NHL draft for some reason that year. And then it kind of revealed to me this entire other world of junior hockey. And I was still kind of in that stage of the early obsession where I just wanted to know everything I possibly could about everything to do with hockey. So I was like, okay, this is an entire other bit of hockey. I'm going to start watching this. Don't know why I picked the OHL specifically. I think it was because by that time I was a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. So I was like, okay, Ontario, let's pick
that. You're outnumbered here, Hayden, sorry.
Oh, damn it.
That's fine. So yeah, and I just started watching a couple games through any means I could. I think the best thing for me with getting involved in it, though, I had a university year abroad, actually, and I actually went to live over in Ontario for a year, and I lived in a town just off Kitchener, so I managed to sit in the Kitchener Rangers rink for what felt like an entire year, and that I think that was the kind of thing that really solidified, like, oh yeah, this is a fantastic league, I'm going to be watching this probably forever, and it's just got worse from there.
Yeah, you always find it starts somewhere, and then I mean, because we've mentioned it on the show a couple of times in terms of where Chris and my love of the sport came from. I've been watching it for like the last sort of, it was kind of the Bruins Cup was when I definitely started watching it, which funnily enough, I'm not a Bruins fan. So we can get on just fine here. It's okay. But, you know, it's like, when's the first kind of draft that you really remember then? Because you said that the draft was kind of a big catalyst for you know, getting involved in the OHL. Is there a specific draft that you remember?
Yeah. I mean, the 2016 one was what I got into it, but I can't remember a ton about it. I think it would have to be, I think 2017 or 2018 was when I started following the prospects, like through their junior journeys, and actually researching and buying a bunch of guides and reading everything I could, scouting reports. And I think it was the 2018 draft that I actually had my own opinions about the players, and that just felt really cool because these people were getting drafted, and you were kind of able to say, I like that pick, I don't like that pick. And that was not really an experience that I'd had in sports before because I'd never really been a sport person. So yeah, I think that was the main catalyst of everything. And then it just became, okay, I can do that with some of these picks. I want to do that about all of these picks. I want to know more about it. And that was kind of what happened.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of one of those things where, you know, you've started, like you mentioned, you started looking at certain players and then making your own judgments on picks, and then you notice that other people start to get interested in your thoughts on those picks. You think, oh, hang on a minute, like I wasn't expecting anybody else to like want to know what I have to say about this, because you know you've got all the Darren Dragers, the Craig Buttons, the Elliot Friedmans, you know, giving their like as the insiders of the NHL, or the Bob McKenzie, of course, he's been around forever. But then there's people asking, oh, Caitlin, like, what do you think about this pick? Do you think it's a good pick for my team? And it's kind of that moment, that transition. I've noticed it with the channel that I do on YouTube. It's like people then start to ask you questions about the sport. And you're like, oh, I wasn't like expecting this. You know, it's like, I'm just here to talk about it. But now you want my opinion, you know? It's interesting.
I find the same thing. I'm commentating and people are asking, what do you think about this? I'm like, hang on, you want to know what I think? You want my opinion on this?
Yeah, it's like, I'm just here to talk about it, you know? I'm just here to do my job at the end of the day. Chris, do you have a question? I want to make sure you get to talk a little bit, because otherwise I'm just going to be here like just like spewing questions out.
Yeah, I was kind of, obviously the OHL for us over here in the UK is kind of jumped to the forefront, really, I think, because of one Liam Kirk.
Yes.
And being with Peter, he's definitely jumped kind of to the forefront. How do you, obviously you've followed his path quite a bit and spoken to him. How do you feel his first year has gone? I mean, there's a point per game in the first year. I mean, how do you think it went?
Yeah, I mean, he's been about 2 years in the league right now. It was amazing for me when he was actually drafted into the league, because I started writing about the OHL a couple months before he was drafted into the OHL. So as soon as he got drafted, I was like, right, I know a lot about this kid. I know a lot about the OHL. I can kind of be the bridging point of helping like introduce OHL fans to Kirk and helping introduce Kirk to OHL fans, kind of. So that was really exciting. I think he's exceeded a lot of people's expectations in his first 2 years in the OHL. I think when he got drafted into the NHL, there were a ton of people going like, oh, this is just like a PR pick for the Coyotes. He's not going to actually do anything. He's never going to actually make the NHL or anything. So when he made the OHL, I don't think people were expecting a lot. Also because they had no idea where his ceiling was. He'd just been playing men's British hockey, which is a tough league for anyone to play in. So I think when he went to the NHL, he surprised a lot of people. Obviously, he struggled at the start. It's an entirely new game over there. It's completely different from over here. But he kind of he found his feet, and he started scoring, and then he started feeling it, and he started picking up pace. And I think the last year he was injured for quite a lot of it, unfortunately. But he like you said, he had a ton of goals. He was point per game. I think a lot of people, he forced people to look at him and be like, this guy's a legitimate prospect. He's not just, oh, he's just this British kid who was drafted in the seventh round. He's not just, oh, this person this British kid who's trying to get an NHL place. He legitimately became, okay, there's this very, very skilled British kid who possibly could get an NHL spot. I think he surprised a lot of people, but I don't think he surprised himself is the thing, because as you mentioned, we chatted to Liam a bit on our podcast, and his attitude throughout the entire thing was, I can do this, I can be better, I know that I can go here and perform. I know that I could perform if I get a chance. And it was just very, very surprising because he wasn't actually that surprised that he got drafted into the NHL. And I just thought that attitude was just so refreshing to hear from him.
Absolutely. It's kind of... Oh, sorry, Chris. You go.
That's all right. I was going to say, what do you make of his move across to Sweden in this time? Is it a good move to kind of keep playing hockey wherever he can?
Yeah, actually, I really, really like this move. Obviously, the OHL's not starting up. It's been pushed back even further now. It's been pushed back to, I think, January or February when it was going to start in December. So he needs somewhere to play. Hockey shut down in a lot of places. He obviously can't play in the UK right now. And a lot of the Swedish leagues are playing. And I think Swedish third league as well, which is what the Hockey Ettan is. I think that's a good level for him. It's still men's hockey, but it's not obviously not like top level. I think it's a league where he can go in, feel comfortable with the pace of it, and actually be able to show what he can do. I mean, in his very first game on the team, he had, I think, 2 assists and a goal in his very first game in this league. So hopefully, what I'm hoping that he'll get out of this is he'll get a chance to kind of flex his skills a bit, to be one of the better players and kind of not be playing catch up all the time. I'm not saying that he is in the OHL, but if he progresses to a higher level, he will be one of those guys playing catch up to the level. I think this is a good opportunity for him to kind of hone his skills and try and make little creative plays and actually learn what he can do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it kind of, like you mentioned, he's got off to such a good start over there as well. There's obviously the possibility that if he keeps playing well, we might see him in the Allsvenskan by the end of the year. And especially if the OHL gets pushed back even further to the pushback that they've just brought in, then, spending most of the season playing against second tier, third tier Swedish players, that's pretty good company to keep, whether you've played in the OHL for a couple of years or you're rising up through the ranks elsewhere from throughout Europe and everything like that. I think it's kind of, I want to get your thoughts on this as well, Caitlin. It's kind of whether it's Kirk or some of the other British prospects we've got here, or prospects from countries that are unconventional hockey markets. I think it would be a fair thing to say that you've got to have a bit of that, because you mentioned Kirk was kind of confident but not cocky about his abilities. You notice that a lot of the sort of great hockey players, all of them have to say about some of the great ones is, they knew what they could do, but they didn't have a huge ego, or they didn't present it in a way that, they came across as cocky or arrogant or have a massive ego. So these players from these unconventional markets, they kind of need to have that chip on their shoulder if they want to succeed, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say if you are from like UK or somewhere that is a sort of non-traditional market, I think on the one side, you have to be confident that you know what you can do. You have to know your skills. You have to know what you bring to a team and to a game. But you also have to be dissatisfied with where you are. We see a lot of UK like prospects who are kind of content where they are in the UK. They're the top of their junior leagues or the top of their league they're in right now, and they're fine with that. They like being at the top. I think if you're one of these people who truly wants to make the jump to the NHL or make the jump to a higher European league, you have to know your skills, and you have to know that you can be doing more than what you are. You have to have that drive to play in a better league, to play against better people, to learn more. And I think Kirk definitely has that. And I actually think there are a couple of other GB prospects who have that drive and who might be kind of showing their faces in the actual GB men's team in a couple of years.
I think there is that a kind of almost like a prejudice that if you've got like a Great Britain flag or a kind of lesser hockey nation flag against your name, you've got to work that much harder to be noticed, particularly over in America and Canada, than somebody who's learned to skate before they can walk.
Oh yeah, and I mean, we see this a lot with the OHL, for example. You have tons of Canadian kids who come in and they get noticed and they're fantastic, and then you have someone like Liam Kirk coming in, or someone from like Czech Republic or a different European country, and they have to prove what they can do before people actually pay attention to them. Like Liam was obviously an interesting case when he came into the OHL, but people weren't too bothered until he actually started performing. Then you have some guys that came on the team last year. I can't remember his name. Mark's going to kill me. But there's a guy on the Kingston Frontenacs who came into the team. No one really expected a lot, and he ended up doing incredible that year in the OHL. So yeah, I think there is a tiny bit of a pressure to show what you can do, but also just to try and learn as much as you can.
Yeah, it's kind of being a sponge to everything, isn't it? And you know that especially a lot of the rookies in the NHL, for example, all the interviews that they give, they say, "Oh, I just want to like make sure I learn as much as possible from the veteran guys or the guys that have been round the block a few times." I think based on what we've seen from Liam Kirk and some of the other prospects, whether it be in the major junior circuit in North America, whether it be in places like the KHL, for example, where I don't know if Chris, you saw that I tweeted this earlier, because of the situation, the pandemic and lots of teams going down with the virus. Because like you mentioned, Caitlin, there's lots of leagues that aren't playing, which a lot of them we've covered here on our podcast, but there's also leagues that are playing that have been really badly hit by the coronavirus, and the KHL is the number one suspect of that. But there's been 92 different players under 20 years old that have played in the KHL already this season. They're not even halfway through. So it just goes to show that hockey kind of is becoming a bit more of a young man's game, and it might be an unconventional opportunity that these guys are getting with, some of the star players being out, but that doesn't mean that you can't go into, say, the Peterborough Pete's locker room or go into SK St. Petersburg or CSKA Moscow's locker room and make an impact straight off the bat, right?
Exactly. I think there's a case where you have all these kids and people playing in North America where people don't quite know how that translates to the levels of the European leagues, and they'll go somewhere like the KHL and they'll either be amazing or they'll struggle because it's a completely different game. It just depends on what goes on. But I think right now it is literally just a case of playing hockey wherever you possibly can. I mean, there's very, very limited ice time in the world right now, pretty much. So if it takes going to the KHL to get some ice time, go for it. If it takes going to the Swedish Third League or DEL2 or somewhere, then that's what you're going to do if you want to play this year.
Absolutely, yeah. Chris, do you have anything? Go for it.
I was going to say, how obviously your kind of big affinity with the OHL is a lot to do with the location when you went over there. How do you kind of think the OHL kind of ranks and differs with the other junior leagues over there, your QMHL, your East Coast League?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting one because these definitions seem to change quite a lot. The way that things are standing right now, people see the WHL as the league that kind of produces defensemen. That's the kind of defensive heavy league. And people see the QMJHL as a very offensive heavy league, like a lot of scoring, not a lot of defense. I think even in the draft just gone, a lot of the defensemen out of the QMJHL, they all had the actual defensive game as a weakness of their game because they were more offensively focused. I think the OHL, in comparison to the two of those, is seen as kind of the most competitive and the most well-rounded. All the teams are kind of close-ish together, so you play a lot of games against a lot of other teams, so you get that sort of competitiveness there. But also, it just has some of the best prospects in the world, and there seems to be there's not just a focus on defense, it's not just a focus on offense. And I'm not saying that that's a blanket case for the WHL or the QMJHL, but that's just what they're characterized as. And the OHL is seen as the hardest league out of them all. Like you have cases where kids who can't quite find a place on OHL teams get sent to QMJHL teams, and they end up doing really well. That's not saying the QMJHL is necessarily worse, but the game is slightly different there. Ultimately, though, it's just a case as a fan of what do you like watching, and there's obviously like pros and cons for everything.
No, what would you? Oh.
No, Chris, you go for it. You go for it. You're on a roll
What
here.
would you say? Like, is the way that the OHL plays? You said obviously it's different to over here, and it's slightly different. What is kind of the OHL kind of way of playing?
I would say, in a way, it's like a mini NHL. Obviously not as skilled at all, not as fast at all, but it is fast. It is skilled. Obviously, you're dealing with teenagers, so it gets quite rough at times. You get hormones flying everywhere. It's generally what happens. People hold grudges. You get fights lasting entire games. It's interesting. But also, I think the thing that characterizes the OHL for me, and the thing that I really love about watching it, is that all of these kids have so much to prove. You get the ones who are destined to go to the NHL who want to try and like raise their draft stock as much as possible. You have guys who maybe were signed as free agents who want to prove they're worthy of the NHL. Like these kids they're still learning, but they're all desperately trying to find a handful of NHL spots. And I think every single game, there's hardly anyone who takes a game off or takes a shift off in the OHL. Everyone's going out there. Everyone wants to prove themselves, and it's very, very evident in the way they play. A lot of games feel like playoff games, and then when you actually get the playoff games, sometimes it's like an entire melting pot, and crazy things happen, and it's just insane. So yeah, and I think a part of that is that because it's so crazy and so unpredictable, you just literally don't know what to expect. Like, crazy things can happen. Because these teams are still learning. Like, you can have a team that's down like 0-6 in the first period, the end of the first period, and then they end up winning the game like 11-10 or something. It's like you get absolutely insane scorelines, and it's just so fun to watch.
Speaking of it being,
what you say, because
go for it, Chris. Go for it. we're gonna do this over every question, so you may as well do it. Go for it.
We are going. I'm going to say that again. Interesting when we're over here. Like I see games and report on games in the Elite League, and because they haven't got anything to prove, like they're not desperately trying to get an NHL spot, as you say. You get like midway through the third period, and you're down by a few goals, and you just watch them just kind of not trying as much as they were and giving up. So it's almost like every game is a playoff game in the OHL, because they never know when a scout's going to be watching them. They're trying to impress every single time. Whereas over here, when we've got players in their 30s and what have you, who are towards the end of the career, they know that kind of this is as good as it's going to get for them. And they're almost at times just going through the motions to get a paycheck if the game's not going their way.
It's very, very different from I'm going to say EIHL hockey, because I haven't seen a lot of other UK leagues. EIHL is, as we know, it's getting a ton more skilled than it used to be. But North American leagues are just a step up, and even North American junior leagues. But you have in the EIHL, it's a tough league to play in. It's still pretty physical, even though it's not as physical as it used to be, in terms of just fighting every single game. But it is tough. These are men, and they're maybe not the most offensive guys on their team, but they know how to play. They know how to do all the little things right. They know how to play defense. They're not giving you an inch in here. Whereas in someone like the OHL, they're kids. They make mistakes. They try little fancy moves, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But I think that's just. I think both leagues are very fun to watch. I am an EIHL fan as well.
Which Elite League team, or just?
I mean, I grew up in Wales, so has to be the Cardiff Devils, and not just bandwagon, but
I went to university in Cardiff, and just the cold in the big blue tent is just when we were down there. Whenever Nottingham went down there, I'd go when I was at university, and it was so cold.
I love the big blue tent. Just a wooden structure, blue tarpaulin and ice. That was pretty much it.
You could hear the music from about half a mile away because the tent just didn't hold the sound at all.
There were times when I thought it would just break entirely, because everyone used to stamp when the games were going on. The entire place would shake. Just for, what a rink. I miss it a lot.
So we've talked a lot about the OHL, and you've obviously discussed how maybe more well-rounded it is compared to some of the other major junior leagues in North America. The one thing I do want to ask you about, especially regarding the OHL, is the news that there may or may not be body checking taking place in the OHL this year. Obviously, the Ontario Health Minister, Health and Sport Minister, I believe it was. I don't remember her name off the top of my head, but she's come out and said, look, if the OHL wants to play, you got to have no body checking because, the potential that it could have to spread the coronavirus. You might know a little bit more about this than us, because obviously you follow the OHL far better than us, but has there been any more sort of discussion about how that's going to work? I think I saw the Ontario Premier. Is it the Premier that they call the guy in charge of each of the provinces? He said that he wants to have body checking. It still sounds like there's a bit of infighting within the government there. Do you think there's going to be no body checking? Is there going to be body checking? Like, what's the latest in terms of the rules and how the OHL is going to go about doing things this year, if there is a this year?
Yeah, it was a very weird situation this week because we had the Ontario not health minister, Ontario Sport and Tourism one and whatever else she does, Lisa McLeod. You had it just adamantly saying, right, there's going to be, if the OHL wants to come back, there's going to be no body checking, no contact whatsoever. It's a health matter, not a politics matter, and a whole bunch of other things she was saying. Interesting enough, another thing she said was that she came to the conclusion that there should be no body checking by watching the QMJHL, the Quebec League, because that started up in October, and there have been a lot of coronavirus outbreaks on those teams. What's interesting to me is that she says, okay, no body checking because there's been outbreaks in the QMJHL. As far as I'm aware, there's been no evidence out of the QMJHL that it was teams playing each other that caused the outbreaks. They were all localized on the teams themselves. But I'm not a health minister. I don't know that kind of thing. So she was very adamant. She was replying to everyone on Twitter. People were getting annoyed. And then the Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, was like, I'd like to see there be body checking. This isn't decided yet. There hasn't been a decision taken. So no one quite really knows where we're at. We do have about 3 months to actually come up with an answer on this, whether there will be body checking or whether they won't. Personally, I don't understand the decision to not have body checking. I think it might be one of the measures you take to prevent people getting too close to each other, to prevent a COVID spread. But you take that measure way after you do things like separating players on the bench, making them all wear masks in the locker room, limiting the time on the team bus and everything. And those things are just not going to happen. So body checking feels like too little too late if you're not going to do the rest of those things to me. And realistically, how much contact are you actually going to have with someone else by throwing them a hit? If you ban body checking, you're going to have more time digging for pucks in the corners. There'll be people in closer proximities trying to battle for pucks. So it doesn't make sense to me. And I know there were a lot of people on the yay physicality in hockey side of Twitter that were very angry at her. I don't mind about physicality in hockey. I would watch hockey if there was no body checking. I just don't understand the decision to take it out, especially when it's such a crucial skill for these teenagers to learn, these young players to learn, in terms of decision making and what you do on the ice and where you position yourself on the ice. It's such a crucial skill for the next level. I just can't see a season going ahead with no contact, no body checking whatsoever. It just doesn't make sense. It just wouldn't be the OHL. It wouldn't be OHL hockey. But as things are playing out right now, I honestly don't think we'll have an OHL season at all. But I live in hope.
Don't we all? I mean, we've got to have something to keep us, occupied with all of the lockdowns and everything else going on. So it sounds like, obviously, like you said, nothing's been decided entirely in terms of body checking. It might just be a couple of people jumping the gun or wanting to put their stamp or their opinion on how they think the season should run. I think it's a good point that you make about, will it make a huge difference in whether it'll actually curb the spread of the virus if the virus is present on the team. I'm very much in agreement with you in the sense that there's so many other steps that should be taken in order to limit that as a possibility. That let's be honest, I remember listening to, I think it was Overdrive on TSN. They did a discussion about this, and they mentioned nobody's like going face to face with somebody when they check them. They're not like breathing into their face. So the chance of the virus actually being spread in a body from body checking is kind of minuscule. And then the other thing they brought up, which I think is really important, is the fact that if there's no body checking and they take out that kind of physical element of the game, yes, it might become more of a skill game. And we've seen examples of other leagues that might not necessarily have as much checking. Women's hockey has been an example where everybody's like, well, the product is great. Women's hockey is great. There's less checking in it. It's still a fantastic product. But at the same time, like you mentioned, Caitlin, you need to be able to body check. You need to be able to withstand hits if you're going to have a hope in hell of making it to the NHL. And there's a lot of these prospects, a lot of these guys that are hoping to go in the first, second, third rounds, maybe even get drafted at all, where the physicality is a huge element of their game. And if they don't get the chance to showcase that against either players their age or get the chance to showcase it whatsoever, they might be in a position that because of one decision that's made by people that don't necessarily play the game or are involved in the league itself, we could see these guys not being drafted by NHL teams or going far further down and maybe not getting the sponsorship offers they might have got beforehand. So it can have a real effect on a player's career, can't it?
Yeah, and I think another major part of this is that I think part of it is because the OHL season is in doubt, but I think another part is this news about no body checking. We're seeing quite a lot of like 2021 NHL draft picks out of the OHL expressing desire to play in Europe or actually going to play in Europe. There's one that I know of, Chase Stillman, who's a draft pick for next year's NHL draft. He's gone to play in Denmark because there's no OHL hockey right now. And I think if there is no body checking, you will see a ton more of these players going like, okay, then I'll play somewhere where I can actually play a proper hockey game. Because there's nothing stopping them apart from maybe the OHL team saying yes or no. There's nothing stopping them just going to Europe.
It would, to me, it would change the game a lot, because if you can't have like an instant check and then go away, then surely you can't have any board play at all, because then you're in a massive scrum. You're far more likely, surely, to pass it in face-offs where you've got two people, faces right next to each other. And when the linesman takes forever to drop the puck, they're there for 5-10 seconds, rather than an instant hit and you're away again.
Yeah, exactly. And I think another part of it is that just it's so unlikely to get it from there. But also, if you are trying to outlaw body checking in the OHL or whatever, where do you draw the parameters of what counts as a check?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you define it? Is it just bumping into someone? Is it just going next to someone? Is it specifically a hit along the boards, or is it something else? You get into a whole definition thing where any contact can be considered a check, any contact can be considered not a check. I reasonably cannot see how it can actually be done.
I think it's like with all of these sports, and we see it in football over here as well, is that you can't really play competitive sport and not come in close contact with other people. Like, football, where you can't make a tackle if you can't go near the person. Hockey, you can't, put someone against the boards without being close to them. They've even restarted the Six Nations. I mean, if you're wanting for a close contact sport, check out, 15 men in a scrum with their heads all together. I think you just need to kind of get to a point where you take the precautions, but you still got to play the game the way it is.
Maybe you've just got to have social distanced hockey, and everybody has to stay 2 meters away from each other, and like that. That's going to be an exciting product. Then you might as well just lie
down in front of the goal.
Exactly. But then you can't get too close to the goalie, because then you're 2 meters too close, and then there's another problem. It kind of sounds like they're going to have to completely rewrite an element of the rule book, which kind of sounds
you may
like
as well not call it hockey.
Exactly, and it just sounds like so much more hassle than is worth. Really, it's kind of like then you get to the point: is there any point really having a season, or going, okay, guys, kind of similar to the Elite League here and some of the other leagues, going, look, we're not going to have a season this year. Like, you've still got some time to go in the season. We haven't hit the new year yet. Go and spend a few months in either a comparable league or whichever league you want, and kind of get some reps in.
Which comes back exactly to what Caitlin said.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just not going to work. And the OHL is one of those leagues that cannot survive with no ticket revenue for an entire season. A bubble situation just isn't feasible because these are kids going to school. Something needs to be done for us to have OHL hockey this year. And I don't think taking out body checking is the answer to that.
I think a lot of people they've seen what the NHL did with finishing the playoffs and gone, well, why can't we do that? Mm. And what they fail to realise is quite how much money that costs the NHL. And that was just a case of finishing off a season, not playing an entire season with no fans at all. Because they did lose an extortionate amount of money just finishing those playoffs off.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And there were a bunch of teams that individually themselves lost a ton of money from that. It's just not feasible for something that isn't a top sports league.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think if you're talking the World Junior Championships, like we've mentioned on the show, they're going to go into a bubble, kind of do the similar kind of thing as what in the Edmonton arena, because that's where the Stanley Cup finals were held and the conference finals. for a week, 10-day tournament, that's perfect. You know, you've got your rosters, they're sorted, they quarantine for 2 weeks, they then go play. Then if they're eliminated, they can leave again, problem solved. But like we've heard with the NHL, there were some talks about doing some bubbles, and there's obviously been the discussion about maybe realigning the divisions. What I think people seem to forget is the NHL has millions and millions of dollars behind them. It cost them millions to have the bubble going. So the good thing is, from that perspective, they've got the financial backing to be able to go, okay, we can put something out there. But similar to the OHL or the other major junior leagues or the EIHL, there's just, like you mentioned, Caitlin, the game day revenue is the biggest percentage of the money they make every single week throughout the entire season. So if you can't have either a certain amount of fans there, or if fans are completely denied the ability to go and see the game, then a lot of these teams, if you try to put a product on the ice, they're going to lose money and they're going to be bust by the time the season's over.
Mm-hmm. It's a really sticky situation, because on one hand, we know you can't have fans in the rinks right now. Like in Sweden, they just had to change it from 300 fans to 50 fans because there are a bunch of COVID outbreaks in a couple of arenas. And you also just cannot survive as a team without that ticket revenue. There's just a question of what do you do right now. It might just be a case of just cancelling the season entirely, like I think they might do in the UK.
Well, yeah, I think that's what's coming in. I mean, we said when we spoke to with the BBC, they spoke to Neil Black earlier in the season, and he said we need the arena 2/3 full to break even. With the National Ice Centre holding 7,500, and they said, well, we've worked it out with the mapping, and you can have about 2,000 fans in. Well, it doesn't take a genius to work out that 2,000 isn't 66% of 7,500.
Yeah.
So it's much easier for the clubs, and obviously Nottingham is one of the richer clubs in the league as well. It's much easier for the clubs to kind of go into limbo and not have player wages than it is to try and put something on. The worst case scenario is get a team together because you're told the league is going to start. You play for a month and then everything kind of goes wrong again and you have to stop. And then you've spent all these player wage bills and then you've had it. I mean, even with the NHL, I mean, obviously today is election day in America. We don't know what the new president is kind of rules or anything that they might put in depending on the situation.
I think it's just 2020 right now. Everything is unexpected. No one knows what's going to happen. Minor sports are doomed in most countries, definitely including the UK. It's quite
this is a year which is going to come up on GCSE history papers in a few decades' time, isn't it? And assess the impact of 2020 on everybody.
Yeah, quite literally. But it's kind of by the sounds of it, the OHL, the one comparison I think Chris and I can draw based on the stuff we've talked about on this podcast is the German DEL. Obviously, the DEL2 has been playing as far as I'm aware, but the DEL, they've pushed back their season for a second time. There's been no talk, as far as I'm aware, in terms of limiting some of the rules or whatever, but at the same time, they've applied to the German government to try and get some emergency funding because they've lost so much money from the fact they can't play. It's kind of every single different aspect of it, whether it be the financial side, the social side, trying to do all of these different things. There's always one that doesn't quite line up and it causes a problem for us. Then it's like the whole thing falls down again, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there are so many of those issues. Like I'm pretty sure the OHL has applied, if we're talking the OHL, it has applied to the Ontario government for funding. But another major sticking point with the OHL is that there are 3 American teams in the league. How do you balance that? The border's pretty much closed. You can't physically keep going across the border. Parents aren't going to want to send their children into COVID-riddled America to play games, and there's a question of what do you do there? Do you keep these teams based in Canada? That'll take a heck of a lot of money. But how else do you do it for the season? That's a massive issue that just hasn't been cleared up yet. They've had a couple of meetings on it and it just hasn't been solved. Because I don't know how it can be solved. So yeah, you have all these issues and just nothing seems possible.
I think that's another problem that we've got here is that we've got a league of 10 teams in 4 different countries, and they've all got different rules at the moment, which is also hindering our problem, hindering the league getting back over here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating time, isn't it? 2020. I think we're all at the point where we've just all had enough, and you know what's going to happen. It's going to tick over to the 32nd of December by the end of the year, and we're like, okay, what's going on here? Like, I feel like the last thing we need is just like the apocalypse, and everything's just going to like end. You know.
To be honest, I think the first half of 2021 is going to be much like the 2020.
Yeah,
so
it's going to be a question of how long does it last after the new year, and it's going to be like, oh, it's only going to last a couple of months. Oh, it's only going to last half the year.
That's what we thought. That's what we thought
exactly.
last year, wasn't
it?
Exactly.
So it's all been doom and gloom. 2020 sucks and we hate it. And the quicker we get out of it, the better. But rather than be doom and gloom for the entirety of this podcast, I wanted to ask Caitlin if there's any exciting things you have coming up in terms of your work with the OHL, with your podcast, with Mark, like you mentioned. Have you got any... What are your kind of plans in terms of within the hockey world within the next kind of months? Have you got some fun things to look forward to? Because we need something here, Caitlin.
Yeah, I know. We have a couple of potential things coming up on the podcast. I need to message someone that I keep putting off, and Mark's been yelling at me to message this person. But if we get this guy on the podcast, it'll be a massive coup for our podcast. One of the premier hockey analysts in the NHL, hopefully. But that's kind of still kind of on the back burner. Aside from that, again, it's very difficult to make plans in hockey right now. I think if we're talking about the work I do for Dobber Prospects, we're going to do an updated 2021 NHL draft ranking, because we're still doing that despite the fact there's no league right now. So that's coming out soon. But apart from that, it's really just playing it by week, seeing what happens. I know at least in the UK, the EIHL streaming series of games has just been given the green light to go ahead.
That's a highly debated topic amongst people in the EIHL.
Yeah, but if it does go ahead, we might actually get some hockey to watch. So that'll be interesting to see at least.
It's like, at the end of the day, I'll take what I can get at this point.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't care if it's grassroots hockey, if it's NIHL, if the NHL decides to come back, like, just give me some hockey and give it to me now, because we've been starved of this sport for so long.
We'll just have to play hockey video games in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the only option we've got, really. But yeah, is there anything else you want to ask, Chris, before we finish up?
Not particularly. I was going to say that we should do, when the NHL starts up, we should do like a group podcast like fantasy draft and pit like Europuck podcast fantasy team against other podcasts from around. Get Caitlin and Mark on, and
yeah,
that'll be fun.
Yeah, we need to like kind of network with some of the other podcasts. We need to find more like UK-based hockey podcasts that we need to kind of have a chat to. I know there's a couple of others out there that we haven't quite reached out to yet, but we're Chris and I have been sitting there juggling because we decided to just throw out a load of invites to a load of people, and now we're sitting there going, oh, like loads of them actually got back to us and want to come onto the show. So we're like, okay, we need to put this person this week, and we need to put this person next week, and we're like, oh my god, there's so many people.
Yeah, it's like players, coaches, refs, podcast people. It's like, what do we do?
And then we're like, oh, we've got enough hosts or enough guests until Christmas. We should be great. And then it's like, oh, but then we need to talk about so many other different things as well. Like there's a constant changing landscape. Where are we going to fit it all in? I mean, at least I'd rather be in that position than kind of sit there like our Boston Bruins podcast last year and be like, well, they're not playing again this week, you know?
Yeah. What we're going to do this week? Or even when they were playing, it was, they won again this week and Pasternak scored again this week.
Yeah, exactly. So just to round it off, Caitlin, do you want to just give the people listening to the show a bit of an overview of the podcast that you do? Obviously, I would imagine that a lot of people listening to this might be interested in your podcast, especially if they're interested in the work that you do and, you know, the kind of discussions that we're having here. I would imagine that would kind of interest them. So tell us about your podcast.
Yeah, so it's called Hockey from Across the Pond. Mark at Mark UK Leaf on Twitter, he's the one who came up with it, and he's the one who was the main guy behind it. He brought me on in January, so I've been his co-host since then, and it's been a lot of fun. Like, as you said, you message people, these really high up people, or people who you think are kind of out of the league of the podcast, and they're always so generous with their time, and they're like, fine, let's go on. So we've had a lot of really, really great guests in the past. We did a series just as lockdown hit, when it was the 1 year of GB's miraculous games in the World Championship. So we did where we interviewed a bunch of GB people from staff. We had Chris Ellis, we had, and then we had like people like Ben Bounds, Ben Davies, and we had a bunch of players on as well. And that was really, really fun. Obviously, as we mentioned in the podcast a bit earlier, we had Liam Kirk on as well as a guest on 1 week, which was amazing, since that's, for some reason, Kirk has become Mark and Mine's brand for the podcast. Yeah, we've had a couple of great guests out of the OHL as well. We had Ty Nelson, who was the first overall draft pick into the OHL. And yeah, so we chat to people, we have good guests. Mark and I debate random things. We talk about hockey news all over the world. We debate about fruit, which has been the last few weeks for some reason, like what is better, oranges or lemons. I don't know why we do that.
Okay.
But yeah, again, it's lockdown. There's hardly any hockey on. You're trying to find stuff to talk about. We did a series just as lockdown hit about like what was your favorite top 5 favorite TV shows, top 5 favorite cereals, top 5 favorite a bunch of other things. So it's not exclusively a hockey podcast.
Okay.
But if you want to hear two people just rant about anything for an hour or so, just a bit of escapism from the bleakness that's going on, then yeah, check us out. It's always a lot of fun.
So it's hockey from across the pond.
Kind of similar to.
You want to go, Chris? Yeah.
I was going to say it seems very much similar to our feature of what exciting thing has Chris done this week.
Yep, absolutely. It's kind of
Which
that you need to find something to talk about. Yeah, exactly. You just need to find something to talk about at the end of the day. So just to clarify for everybody listening, it's called Hockey from Across the Pond, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts, I would imagine. Spotify, Apple.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, it's on Anchor, it's on a whole bunch of other things. You should be able to find it on most podcast providers. So
Okay.
yeah, and check us out.
Perfect. So if you enjoyed listening to this rambling about how the OHL is, what's going on with it, and talking about British hockey, then I'm sure you guys would love that podcast there. Thank you very much, Caitlin, for joining us. We really do appreciate you taking the time out to come and sit with us for a little while. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been fun.
So yeah, that was our interview with Caitlin Berry for this week's episode of the Europuck podcast. A very big thank you to Caitlin for joining us this week. I don't know about you, Chris, but I had a really good time. Did you enjoy talking to her too?
Oh, of course I did, yeah.
I mean, I would hope so, because otherwise, not enjoying talking to our guests wouldn't give a very good impression. But, I had to put you on the spot there a little bit. But, yeah, I think on that note, it's a perfect place to end this week's episode of the Europuck podcast. If you want to keep updated on all things Europuck podcast, or send us your thoughts, opinions, or questions, either from today's show during this interview or for our next episode, you never know, we might have another guest coming up, then you can send them to us at Europuck podcast on Twitter, or if you want to go and follow either our individual Twitters or send us your thoughts more personally to one of us, you can follow myself on Twitter at OddmanRushYT, as it says up there, or Chris at Chris_Gadsby. Thanks again for listening, guys, and we'll see you again next time. Have a good one, folks.